Hello, our topic is Christian theology and quadrant house systems. And that might sound like a strange combination. There's an idea in astrology called quadrant house systems, and this has something very close to do with Christian theology. Yes, it really does, as odd as that may sound. And you can think of it like this. Ideas develop within a culture, whether it's art, music, science, architecture, any other activity that humans are involved in. Of course, it develops within the culture, within the lifestyle of the people. And as we're going to see, this idea of quadrant house systems is introduced at exactly the same time that Christianity starts to develop and grow in Europe. And in Europe, which rapidly becomes Christian, dominantly Christian throughout the Middle Ages. As Christianity flourishes throughout Europe, quadrant house systems flourish throughout Europe. So quadrant house systems did not exist before Christianity. They develop around the same time, they flourish at the same time. And now, in the last, say, 50 years or so, as people have more choice about religion, and there's more global integration, and it's not sort of assumed that you're necessarily Christian because you're born into countries that were predominantly Christian. It's also no longer assumed that you use quadrant house systems. And this is very, very recent. So you might say the rise and culmination and, well, I don't want to say fall, but at least the lowering of the popularity total dominance of Christianity and quadrant house systems in predominantly Christian countries all happen simultaneously. And when you look at countries that are not predominantly Christian, such as India, where astrology is very big, quadrant house systems are not strong in India. Never were, are not now, and probably never will be. They know about quadrant house systems. Some Vedic astrologers use quadrant house systems. They're just not dominant, just like they know about Christianity in India. And there are tons of Christians and Christian temples or churches, whatever you want to call them, in India. But it's not so dominant. So there's this close historical tie of quadrant house systems with Christianity. Now, if you're a student or a professional astrologer, maybe you didn't know that quadrant house systems were invented at the same time that Christianity became developed and grew. But it's a historical fact. I'm going to take you through some of the more ancient history of astrology and how the quadrant house systems came in and changed the way of thinking and how they are so closely tied with the Christianity. Okay, so what are house systems? Let's build this up from the ground up. As you know, there are 12 zodiac signs, and the zodiac signs are a way of dividing the sky into 12 pieces. And you may also know there are different ways of dividing the sky into 12 zodiac signs. There's what we call the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac. And there's a second way. The sky is divided into 12 sections called the 12 houses. And just as with zodiac signs, there are different ways to do it. And around the 2nd to 3rd century, this idea of quadrant houses is introduced. It's not the first house system. It's introduced and becomes the dominant house system specifically in Europe. Now, let's learn more about what a quadrant house system is and how it differs from the house system that preceded the quadrant houses, the house system that existed before quadrant house systems. Okay, there's a lot on this slide. Let's go through it one step at a time. First of all, we have 2 birth charts for the same person. It's singer-songwriter Donovan. And the one on the left, this chart wheel on the left, is a quadrant house system. The one on the right is now referred to as whole sign houses. Whole sign houses are the older house system that preceded the development of Christianity. Okay, so first there were whole sign houses, and then later on some alternatives were developed, such as what we call equal houses. I'll explain what they are, and the quadrant houses. Now notice that the planet positions in both chart wheels are the same. So for example, the sun is at 18 degrees 57 minutes of Taurus on the left. It's still 18 degrees 57 minutes of Taurus on the right. It's the same chart wheel. The difference is the houses. And on the left, a quadrant house system takes the ascendant and makes it the starting point. The ascendant. And the ascendant, just very briefly, is where what we call the ecliptic plane, which is the apparent path of the sun in the sky, where it intersects the horizon, what we call the celestial horizon, a perfect horizon that has no mountains or valleys, is called the ascendant. It's regarded by astrologers as an extremely powerful point. And for Donovan, the ascendant is 10 degrees 5 minutes of Gemini. And then what's introduced with the quadrant house system is this point called the midheaven. And the midheaven is the highest point in the sky. So as the sun rises and reaches its highest point and then begins to set, that point where the sun reaches its highest point in the sky is called the midheaven. And actually all of the planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and all of the stars, they all reach a highest point in the sky and set. And that highest point goes north, south, and directly over your head, which is called the zenith. So what happens with quadrant house systems is that this midheaven point, highest point in the sky, becomes the beginning of what's called the 10th house cusp. So this thick line here is the midheaven. Now you might wonder, why is it skewed to the right? Why isn't it, like 90 degrees vertical? And the reason is because the ecliptic plane does not necessarily go directly east. As you know, in summer and winter, the sun does not rise directly to the east. And Donovan was born in Glasgow, Scotland, at 55, almost 56 degrees north latitude. And at those very high latitudes, very far from the equator, the sun can rise very far from east, very close to being north or south. And it makes the distance from the ascendant to the midheaven very short or very long. So in his case, it's long. And you have this big area here between the midheaven and the ascendant. So this is the quadrant house system. You take the midheaven and the ascendant, you divide it into 3 sections. So you have 4 quadrants. You divide the sky into 4 sections, and each of those 4 sections is divided into 3 sections. You have your 12 houses. Now, astrologers never agreed about exactly how do you divide this distance from the midheaven to the ascendant, but through the Middle Ages, they were convinced. They just had this intuition that the midheaven is so incredibly powerful. It's the beginning of the 10th cusp. And the ascendant is so powerful. It's the beginning of the first cusp. And there must be this cross in the sky. Okay, and this idea started to develop around 200 to 300 AD, that there must be this cross in the sky that defines the critical turning points of our lives, the critical power points. Now, in countries that are not predominantly Christian, like India, this idea never became dominant. So through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and right up to today, quadrant houses are not the dominant house system in India. They still use the more ancient system, whole sign houses. Okay? So, of course, this cross in the sky, what is one of the images of Christianity? The cross. And for some reason, astrologers just felt there had to be this cross in the sky, and they became almost obsessed with this idea of quadrant houses, trying to figure out where these intermediate cusps are. They must be there, but they could not agree. And they developed different house systems. Today they're called Placidus, Regiomontanus, Campanus, different ways to divide each of the quadrants. And in these quadrant house systems, like this particular one happens to be Placidus, in all of these quadrant house systems, the astrologers agree They agreed in the Middle Ages, and they still agree today about where the ascendant, the midheaven, and the opposite points of the descendant and the IC, sometimes midheaven is called MC, so the MC and the IC, these four critical points, they all agree that they are there, and they all agree that they are powerful. What about in India with Vedic astrology? They agree about the ascendant. They agree the ascendant is all powerful. But in most of Vedic astrology, they don't even use the midheaven. Wow. I mean, not only do they not have quadrant house systems, they don't even put the midheaven in the chart. Okay? So the idea of the ascendant is older, historically older than the midheaven. And then the midheaven gets introduced as an important point, and then later it's decided that the midheaven is not only an important point, but it must be the beginning of a house, because there must be this cross in the sky. So on the left is a quadrant house system, just to review and make sure you got this, and these what we call intermediate cusps. So this line up here that I'm pointing to, where the ecliptic plane intersects the meridian plane. Meridian plane is the name for this midheaven line that goes north-south over your head, which is the zenith, and below you, which is called the nadir. This line where all the planets reach their highest point on that meridian plane, it's called, and where the ecliptic plane intersects that is the midheaven. That is the 10th cusp, according to this tradition that developed and flourished in Christian Europe with that powerful cross in the sky. And great mathematicians, astronomers and astrologers used very advanced mathematics to try to figure out where these cusps are. And they could never agree, and consequently we have these different house systems. Now on the right is the whole sign houses. And the idea with the whole sign houses is there is an ascendant. So Donovan has 10 degrees, 5 minutes of Gemini rising. There is the same ascendant, and here it is. And we have AS, obviously indicating ascendant, 10 Gemini 05. But in the whole sign house system, which is widely used and still used today throughout India, and is now being revived just in the last 10, 20 years in the West, there is this all-powerful ascendant, but it is not the beginning of the first house. It's just in the first house. Because what they did in the very ancient astrology, and still do today in India, and getting revived in Western astrology today, what's happening is you just count how many signs apart the zodiac signs are. So, for example, with Gemini rising, which is what Donovan has, if we count from Gemini to Virgo, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, the moon is in the fourth sign from the rising sign. So that fourth sign from the rising sign is sometimes called the fourth house. So in this whole sign houses, you don't really have houses. You just have zodiac signs, and you consider the number of signs separating, like from Gemini to Virgo, to be important. And this idea of whole sign houses gradually develops into an idea of quadrant houses in Christian Europe. Okay. And by the way, at the bottom I have a note here that most of the information in this video regarding dates, so when I tell you that this happened in the 2nd to 3rd century or all these things, this is all taken from, mostly from James Holden and Francesca Rochberg, two highly respected historians, and other historians agree with everything that I'm presenting. So I'm not going to quote sources for most things because I want to move through this more quickly, but that's where the information is coming from. Okay, so let me give you some history to this and how the Christian era and the quadrant house systems comes into the picture. So first, we have Babylonia before 500 BC. And mostly what's happening here is that people are looking at the sky, and think about the sky at night, with on a clear night with the Milky Way, and, all these glittering little objects, and they're looking at it, as this domain of the heavens and getting omens from it. And we also know that astrology goes all the way back 2000 BC, more, probably 3000 BC in India. There's mentions of astrology in the Vedas. So throughout this large area in the world, there's astrology being practiced with an emphasis of looking at the deep space, this, you might say, mystical, awesome, starry firmament. And then, around 500 BC, we start to see a change in astrology. For example, around 430 BC, a fellow named Euctemon, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, he appears to know about the vernal equinox, that point in the sky where the sun is when spring begins. And he places the vernal equinox in the sky. Now we know that people much more ancient than 500 BC put a lot of emphasis on the vernal equinox. You can look at Stonehenge, other monolithic structures which are oriented to where the sun is when it rises on the first day of spring. The north, south, east, west, perfectly aligned, and many of these structures go back to 3000 BC, possibly even earlier. So they knew about the vernal equinox, but we don't have strong historical evidence that it became a powerful point astrologically. It became important for understanding when to grow crops and things like that, but a kind of sophisticated, intricate form of astrology starts to develop somewhere around 300 to 500 BC, or gets revived and gets passed down. And we see awareness of the vernal equinox around 430 BC, and then it's 300s to 200s BC. In that time range, a lot of things happen. A whole bunch of things happen simultaneously. The vernal equinox starts getting much more attention. Hipparchus discovers and calculates precession of the equinoxes around 127 BC. So by 300s to 200s BC, they're tracking where the vernal equinox is. By 127 BC, they see clearly how it's moving against the stars and what we call precession of the equinoxes. Now, maybe this was known 2000 BC, maybe much older, but we don't have a clear historical sources for this, and we don't have evidence that a rich system of astrology practiced by a lot of people was developed around it. This becomes clearly developed in this time range. Now, think about this. Consider this. That when you start placing the vernal equinox in the sky and tracking exactly where it is, which becomes a big part of astronomy and astrology, somewhere around 300 to 200 BC, you've made a direct connection of our lives on Earth with the heavens. Now again, that connection was known clearly when they built Stonehenge and other things. But the tracking of where that point is against the stars, recording it and relating it to people's lives, becomes a clear tradition that gets passed on to us, coming from around 300 to 200 BC. And so just as the sun rising in the morning marks our days, there are also lunar cycles. And there's now concrete evidence that our seasons that we experience here on Earth are mapped onto that distant starry firmament. It makes a direct connection. It makes a more personal connection of our lives to those distant, beautiful, twinkling stars in the distant sky. So some of the things that are happening between about 500 and 200 BC. Number one, the first birth charts, as far as we know, are really being developed. Before then, astrology was mainly used to see what's happening in the sky. For example, if there's a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction every 20 years, something will happen to the king. There might be a new king when there's a conjunction. So the stars are tracked as omens, as a story, as a divine story that gets reflected in our lives on Earth. But there's not so much emphasis on your birth chart and the differences between individuals. So we have the beginning of birth charts. We have more awareness about the vernal equinox. We have a clear awareness of the equinoxes. We have astrologers now choosing between a sidereal and a tropical zodiac, because some astrologers think, well, gee, maybe the zodiac begins with your vernal equinox. Our seasons do. And this becomes clearly formulated and handed down. Now again, some of these ideas are controversial, and sometimes people like to argue about it. I'm not denying the possibility that these things could be even older. Who knows? And there's evidence. Fine, that's not a problem. All I'm saying is that the astrology we have today is directly inherited from that thinking around 300 to 200 BC. The people with their thoughts and what they recorded then gets passed on to the astrologers around 100 to 200 AD. The books that they wrote, like the Tetrabiblos by Ptolemy, becomes a foundation for astrology today and is part of our heritage, and it influences Europe throughout the Middle Ages. So things might be known, they might be discovered, they might be active, but transportation was limited in ancient times and things could be kept more local. What we see happening is that this idea of the ascendant comes into view somewhere around 200 BC, the vernal equinox and then the ascendant. Okay, so number 4, the rising sign, the sign that is rising, is proposed as being very important, and then the specific point that's rising, the ascendant, starts to become highlighted. So by 100 BC, people know about the vernal equinox, how it's moving in the sky, and they start to become interested in the ascendant. Then they discover the idea of the midheaven. Then they develop the idea of quadrant houses later. Okay. Now, here's how the sequence happens and how it affects Christianity. First, you have the starry firmament, back in Babylonia and ancient India and so on. Then they start placing the vernal equinox in the sky. And by the time of Hipparchus, by 127 BC, the astrologers can track exactly where the vernal equinox is. They know it's moving 1 degree every 72 years, and it's making a direct connection of a point in the sky with our lives on Earth. That makes the sky more personal. The next step, that makes the sky even more personal to me and you, to Sally versus Jane versus Bill versus Tom, is that you have your own ascendant. Not only do we have our seasons for all of us on life on Earth, but each one of us has our own signature in the sky as soon as the idea of the ascendant is introduced. So the ascendant is introduced, and the birth chart is introduced, and astrology becomes highly personalized, beginning around 500 BC and becoming stronger and clearer that each person has their own cosmic signature. And the ascendant depends not only on when you are born, but where you are born. It becomes a point that identifies you. It identifies you individually. And at this time, starting around 500 BC, astrology starts becoming more personal, more individual, and you might say more egalitarian. Before that, astrology was primarily for the kings and queens who are reflecting this cosmic story in the heavens. Now we are all reflecting the story. We all have our own connection to the sky. We are all a little piece or reflection of that cosmic story. Okay, and then astrologers begin counting the number of zodiac signs from the rising sign, as I mentioned. This is called a house system. It is now known as whole sign houses. And it is the most commonly used system in Vedic astrology, and it is also the house system used in the time of what we call Hellenistic astrology. So this rapid development of astrology, beginning really around 300 BC, roughly around the area of the Middle East and Greece, is now called Hellenistic astrology. And it becomes a highly individual, personal astrology, and it develops intricate rules. And then the idea of the midheaven is introduced, and at first the midheaven is just a point in the sky. It is not the beginning of the 10th house. It's just a point in the sky. You would just put it in your chart, and you might say it's in the 9th house, it's in the 10th house. And then it's later, with the development of the Christian era, and this Christian, you might say, ethic, that the midheaven becomes the beginning of the 10th house cusp. Okay. So, somebody gets the idea to count the houses from the ascendant, and this idea begins to develop between the first and second centuries AD. So, here's the order of what happens. First, you have the starry firmament. Then you introduce the idea of the vernal equinox is in that starry firmament, makes a connection with our seasons and the sky. Next step is the idea of the ascendant is introduced. And this makes a connection of each individual to the sky. You still don't really have houses yet. You just have the signs and how far apart the signs are. Those are called whole sign houses. And then, really the first step in what we think of houses today, more than just a relationship of the signs, is the equal house system. So somewhere between the 1st and 2nd century, according to James Holden, the equal house system is introduced. So I have here in bold, historically, whole sign houses is the first system, equal houses are the second system. Ptolemy mentions equal houses. So we know that Ptolemy knew about them. That would be in the 100s, the 2nd century AD. He knew about them. He does not give them a lot of attention. Firmicus Maternus describes them in detail in the 4th century. So they're clearly being used and very important. So the sky is getting more and more individualized, because with whole sign houses, you have only 12 types of people. 12 types. Like maybe I have Aries rising, maybe you have Taurus rising, maybe the next person has Gemini rising. There's not a big emphasis on the degree that's rising. There's the 12 basic types. With the introduction of equal houses, the specific degree matters. So maybe I have 5 degrees of Aries rising. You have 8 degrees of Aries rising. That's different. Our houses are now different. It's becoming more and more individualized. And this puts more and more emphasis on the importance of a birth chart to identify individual differences, how we are different from each other, how we are uniquely different from each other. And we cannot be so easily typed into just a few types. Okay. So here is one quote. I said I'm not going to quote a lot, but here's one quote from James Holden from an article he wrote called Ancient House Division. Sometime between the middle of the 2nd century AD and the end of the 3rd century, in other words, between Ptolemy and Porphyry, 2 very important astrologers, some astrologers abandoned the equal house system, in which the cusp of the 10th house was exactly 90 degrees from the ascendant, and decided that the cusp of the 10th should be the degree of the zodiac that fell upon the meridian. In other words, somewhere between the middle of the 2nd century and the end of the 3rd century AD, quadrant houses were introduced. This is exactly when Christianity is starting to spread. It's moving out of just being in people's homes. The Christians were at first persecuted. Then they got more legal support, and they started building the cathedrals and so on, churches and cathedrals, and then it grew to become a dominant religion. And as it's growing, the movement from this abstract firmament that's global to everybody, to a more and more and more individualized chart with a cross in the sky, that happens as Christianity begins to develop and grow. So, keep in mind, today we have this idea of angular house cusps. In modern Western astrology, it's a dominant idea. We have the angular house cusps. It's not until the quadrant house system is introduced that the idea exists at all. So with the introduction of quadrant house system, a new cycle in the heavens closely tied to each individual. What happens in the Middle Ages is that the cycle of the planets as they rise, culminate, and set, and then 12 hours later after setting roughly, they rise again. The whole sky is spinning around, not just the sun. This movement with these important critical stations of the cross, where for example, the sun crosses these 4 critical points. This diurnal motion takes on a mythological and psychological power, and it becomes fundamental to astrological thinking. Before then, the emphasis was not on the diurnal cycle. It was on the motion of the planets through the stars. That's sometimes called now we sometimes call their secondary motion. As the planets revolve around the sun, you'll see them move through the stars. They were called wandering stars in ancient times because the planets look very much like stars, but they kind of wander around, unlike the fixed stars. So astrology is not just these wandering stars moving around in this divine, beautiful, glittering firmament. Astrology starts to become personal, and the drama of the birth, the fulfillment, the death, and the rebirth and resurrection in this daily cycle becomes a part of the thinking. And it's when the diurnal cycle of the planets becomes a very important part of astrology, is during this time period. And it's very consistent with the Christian emphasis on birth, achieving our goals, death, and then rebirth. Now, and in the second paragraph here, an extraordinary coincidence happens that really helps quadrant house system become dominant. And the extraordinary coincidence is spherical trigonometry. James Holden emphasizes this. Spherical trigonometry develops right around the time that quadrant houses are being developed. It's very well developed throughout the Middle Ages. Spherical trigonometry is a trigonometry of spheres. It allows us to calculate distances between planets measured along these great circles. So it might surprise you that mathematics was this sophisticated in the year 600, 700, 800. It was. And these great mathematicians using spherical trigonometry, many of them were also astrologers and astronomers. And they used this new tool of spherical trigonometry to try to calculate where the intermediate cusps were. So as James Holden emphasizes, the astronomers had a problem to use their toy. They have this new toy, this new tool, this very cool technology called spherical trigonometry, and now they have a problem to try to solve, which is where are the intermediate cusps. And they develop these very clever, ingenious concepts for how to divide the sky, and they come up with different ones. Nobody's able to validate which one might be correct, but they believe they're correct. This is why we have these different quadrant house systems today that go under names like Placidus, Regiomontanus, Campanus, usually named after the person who either popularized or developed that house system. Okay, so I've already gone through all this, but just to review, I haven't mentioned all this. Let me mention these 4 points at the bottom. Christianity emphasizes personal responsibility, sometimes to an extreme, with an emphasis on, for example, whether one is a sinner. So there's a lot of emphasis on you, your decision, what are you doing, and we have this increased emphasis on your individual nature, your responsibility, your birth chart, your goals and your purpose in life. We have the similarity of the Christian cross and the cross in the sky. We have the drama of birth, ascension, death, and rebirth written into the diurnal cycle of the planets and into the story of the life of Jesus, who is born again to save you from your sins. So, he's a personal responsibility, redemption, all these themes. We also have the development of a predictive technique in astrology called primary directions, which is based on the diurnal motion of the planets. So people are going to develop ideas based on how they think about life. I mean, obviously, you can't think of something if it's not in your domain of awareness. So people are developing ideas that are consistent with their view of life. And very often, I think this is just instinctive, intuitive. It's just how we are working. But when you look at it in retrospect, it's amazing how similar the development of astrological ideas in Europe is to the Christian way of thinking. And we really shouldn't be surprised. I mean, all ideas develop within that cultural context. And of course, primary directions do not become big in India and other places. They were not big before the Christian era. They develop as part of this understanding of this cross in the sky and the drama of diurnal motion of the planets. Now, what's the future of quadrant houses? As I mentioned at the beginning, we are now in a more diverse, multifaceted, multicultural, globally integrated world, and as expected, more astrologers are now choosing other house systems. So there's just a perfect parallel between the use of quadrant houses and the prevalence of Christianity. And this doesn't imply that if you use quadrant houses, you're a Christian, literally. It's more of, at a more psychological level, a deeper level behind the specific beliefs, that there are these daily cycles and these critical points. It's more of an archetypal, mythical perception, and not so much tied to some specific ideas, but that archetypal, mythical view of the world is ingrained in whatever religion and philosophy that we embrace. So now we see whole sign house systems being revived. We see equal house system being revived. They're gradually becoming more popular. And what will happen in the future? I have my own ideas about that. I'm going to present that in another video that I'll make very soon. And the title of this video that I'll make very soon is Are Quadrant Houses an Illusion? So this video, Are Quadrant Houses an Illusion, is going to share some of my ideas on where we are headed now in the 21st century with astrology. And to give you a preview of it, I think there's something that's going to replace quadrant houses. And I think it's a variation of equal houses. It's not just equal houses from the Ascendant, but it's a development from that is what's happening. Because we are now again in a changing world view. We are in an information age. We are in a global communication age. We have shed some of the biases, at least hopefully we have, of gender biases, racial biases. I think we are now entering a world of mutual respect and honor and realizing we all have a place. The old kingdoms, the old idea that the royalty or the celebrities are somehow qualitatively different than the average person. That is a pre-Christian way of thinking. We are now developing out of that, where the stepping stone of democracy, that we are all created equal, that we are all empowered, and that everyone in every country has a part in the fullness of life. All of this kind of thinking with the supercharged technology, we are now entering a different era, and not surprisingly, we're entering, I believe, a new understanding of how astrology works, what astrology is, and things like how systems are about to change. So I think astrology is going to undergo some very radical changes. It's already starting, and I don't think that they are, just little fads. And I think it's part of this whole historical development. So things improve and evolve over time. And I think we're about to see that again. Doesn't mean that anything in the past was wrong. We need to incorporate what was good from the past, remove the horrible things that happened in the past and use the good things to build and develop forward, which is what happens in art and science all the time. Newton's theory of gravitation isn't wrong. It's just been put into a more complete context with Einstein's theory and other theories that develop it to new levels. Okay, I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. Okay, my friends. So, quadrant house systems and Christian theology, they have a lot to do with each other, even though at first it might sound like an odd comparison. Okay, thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.